Good day everyone, Max here from Evidence-Based Football Manager. This is part 9 of my FM23 training analysis series. We're going to take a look at the recovery session today. I'm trying to find out how the recovery session affects player fitness and injuries, so I can decide whether the recovery session should be included in my custom training schedule for FM23. First, we'll see how recovery session affects the fitness of players. In Football Manager, there are 3 types of parameters related to fitness. They are overall physical condition, match sharpness, and fatigue. Overall physical condition, or OPC for short, is the parameter that's represented in the game by the heart-shaped icons that are colored in green, yellow, or red. Match sharpness is a parameter that tells you how well a player is prepared for an upcoming match. Match sharpness fills up when players play a match, and it falls gradually when players don't get any match exposure for an extended period of time. Fatigue is a parameter that's not usually visible in the game. It builds up slowly over the season when players are playing too many matches, and once it reaches a certain point, an alert will pop up next to the player's name, which lets you know that you should probably let the player take a bit of a break from first team football. My question is this: when you include the recovery session in your training schedule, do these 3 fitness parameters recover faster? According to the in-game description for the recovery session, it's supposed to reduce the fatigue of players, it's supposed to slightly increase the overall physical condition of players, and it's supposed to slightly reduce the match sharpness of players. But does it really happen, or is it just make-believe? Let's find out. The test setup is pretty straightforward. Using my test league save file, I used the editor to set the fitness parameters of players as follows. OPC was set as 5,000 out of 10,000, which is the lowest you can go without making the players injured. Match sharpness was set as 10,000 out of 10,000, which is the highest possible value. The fatigue parameter is a little bit weird. The maximum fatigue value that you can set is 1,000, which will make the player extremely exhausted. And the lowest value is negative 500, which means no fatigue for the player. So I set the fatigue value of the players as 0 out of 1000, which means the players are pretty tired, but not by excessive amounts. I prepared 2 types of training schedules. The first one is when the players are resting for the whole week. The second one is when the players go through 7 recovery sessions during the week. The test started on Tuesday midnight, and I progressed the game for 4 days until Saturday midnight. At midnight every day during the 4-day period, I recorded the fitness parameters of the players in my test league so I could compare how the fitness parameters changed during the 4-day period. And let's have a look at the results. I have 3 line graphs here. The first graph here shows you the change in OPC of players over the 4-day period. The blue line here is when the players were resting for the whole week. And the orange line here is when the players went through 7 recovery sessions during the week. The second graph here is for the match sharpness parameter, and the third graph here is for the fatigue parameter. In the first graph, if you have a look at the blue line, the OPC of players was 50% at the start of the test, and by day 4, OPC went up on average to around 93%. And if you have a look at the orange line, the OPC of players was 50% at the start of the test, and by day 4 it went up to around 85%. So these results show that OPC of players recovered faster when no recovery sessions were used during the week. Next, let's take a look at match sharpness. If you have a look at the blue line here, the match sharpness of players was 100% at the start of the test, and by day 4, match sharpness went down to around 95%. And if you have a look at the orange line, match sharpness of players fell to around 97% by day 4. So here, recovery session is doing its job. It slowed down the loss of match sharpness of players when the players were not playing any matches. Let's take a look at fatigue this time. If you have a look at the blue line, the fatigue of players was 0 at the start of the test, and by day 4, fatigue went down to around negative 70. And if you have a look at the orange line, fatigue of players fell to around negative 30 by day 4. The fatigue parameter dropped more when players were resting for the whole week and when no recovery sessions were used during the week. You would think that fatigue would drop faster with the use of recovery sessions, but these results showed otherwise. I was pretty surprised by these results, especially the part regarding overall physical condition. So I decided to repeat these tests using a real player in FM23 in a real league. So I chose to go with Erling Haaland of Manchester City. The way the test is set up is the same as before. At Tuesday midnight using Manchester City, I set the OPC of Erling Haaland to 50%, his match sharpness as 100%, and his fatigue as it was set as 0. Two types of training schedules were prepared. The first one, which was filled with rest sessions for the whole week, and the second training schedule, which was filled with 7 recovery sessions throughout the week. Then I made Erling Haaland go through these two types of training schedules for 4 days from Tuesday to Saturday. And we'll have a look at the results. Again, I've prepared 3 line graphs here, one for OPC, one for match sharpness, and one for fatigue. In the first graph, you can see that Erling Haaland's OPC recovered faster when no recovery sessions were used, although by day 4, the difference between the two scenarios are pretty minor. In the second graph, you can see that Erling Haaland's match sharpness fell more slowly when recovery sessions were used. In the third graph, you can see that Haaland's fatigue fell by greater amounts when no recovery sessions were used. So the results that you see here for Erling Haaland is consistent with the results that I showed you earlier using my test league. The same conclusions can be drawn regarding recovery sessions. Recovery sessions slow down the recovery of OPC of players, which is a bad thing. It slows down the loss of match sharpness of players, which is a good thing. And lastly, it makes the fatigue parameter of players fall more slowly, which is a bad thing. Next, we'll have a look at the relationship between recovery sessions and injury risk. According to the in-game description for the recovery session, it's supposed to greatly reduce the injury risk of your players. But is that true? Do players get injured less when you throw in some recovery sessions into your training schedule? Let's find out. For this test, I first needed to establish a baseline rate of injuries. So far in my tests using my test league savefile, I disabled injuries from the database in order to prevent players from getting injured. This was done in order to reduce the statistical noise in my test results. But this time, I do want to see some injuries take place. So I made a new test league save file with the injuries enabled. I ran a baseline test where the players in the test league used the default training schedules that are provided by the base game. At the end of the season, I recorded the amount of injuries sustained by the players throughout the season. And I repeated the exact same test 20 times so that I could gather a big enough sample pool. After that, I ran more tests under the following conditions. I changed the training schedule for the teams in my test league to my own custom training schedule, evidence-based training schedule alpha. Then I gradually added recovery sessions into my training schedule one by one. So that's 20 simulations with EBTS alpha, 20 simulations with EBTS alpha plus 1 recovery session, 20 simulations with EBTS alpha plus 2 recovery sessions, and so on, all the way up to EBTS alpha plus 7 recovery sessions per week, which is the maximum number of recovery sessions you're allowed to use in a single week. At the end of each simulations, I recorded the amount of injuries sustained by the players in my test league. And let's have a look at the results. I've made a line graph here that compares the amount of injuries per season when players used different types of training schedules. When players used the default training schedule provided by the game, they got injured on average 12.8 days per season. So this is the baseline amount of injuries for players in my test league. When players used my own training schedule, EBTS Alpha, they got injured on average 16.1 days per season. So my training schedule did result in more injuries compared to the baseline. When I threw in some recovery sessions into my training schedule, So with one recovery session per week, the players got injured on average 16.4 days per season. With 2 recovery sessions per week, the players got injured on average 15.5 days per season. 3 recovery sessions per week resulted in 16.4 days of injuries per season, and you get the gist. So these are the amount of injuries per player per season as I added more and more recovery sessions into my EBTS Alpha training schedule. So what do you guys reckon? I think it's safe to say that recovery sessions did not lead to a lower rate of injuries for players in my test league. Again, it's a pretty counterintuitive result here because you would think that recovery sessions would lead to lower injury risk for your players, but unfortunately my test results proved otherwise. So here's a summary of what I've shown you today. 1. Recovery session is detrimental to the recovery of overall physical conditions of your players in FM23. If you're in the middle of a congested schedule playing FM23 and you need your players to recover their OPC as soon as possible, don't use any recovery sessions in your training schedule. 2. Recovery sessions can help maintain the match sharpness of your players. If your team is going through a few weeks period without any matches, it could be worth throwing in a couple of recovery sessions here and there, which can prevent match sharpness from being lost too much during that period. 3. Recovery sessions are detrimental for the fatigue parameter of your players. This is another reason why you shouldn't use any recovery sessions in the middle of a congested schedule. 4. Recovery sessions are ineffective for lowering the injury risk of your players in FM23. Since the efficacy of recovery sessions is questionable at best, I have decided not to include any recovery sessions in my evidence-based training schedule. The rate of injuries for my evidence-based training schedule was a little bit higher compared to the default training schedule according to my tests, but I don't think I'm too bothered. The baseline injury rate was 12.8 days per season, while the injury rate for EBTS Alpha was 16.1 days per season. So that's an increment of about 3 days per player per season, which honestly I don't believe is a consequential amount. I reckon 3 extra days of injuries per player per season is something that can be managed using squad rotations when you play FM23. I think I'm pretty close to completing my evidence-based training schedule. There are still 1 or 2 gaps in my knowledge that need to be filled before I can publish the final product, but I think I'm getting closer and closer. After I uploaded my last video, some of you suggested using the match tactics training session in my training schedule. I'm currently in the process of experimenting the effects of match tactics, and I will release the results when they are ready. Okay people, I hope you're all enjoying your Easter holidays wherever you are, and I'll see you guys all next time. Alright guys, cheers. Bye.